On the morning of April 22, 1956, at approximately 8:30 a.m., Soviet and East German soldiers surrounded a small warehouse on Schönefelder Chaussee in the Alt-Glienicke district of East Berlin. The building, unremarkable in appearance, sat less than 200 yards from the border separating the Soviet sector from the American sector of the divided city. Lieutenant Colonel Ivan Kotyuba of the KGB's Second Chief Directorate stood outside the warehouse in a light rain, smoking a cigarette and waiting for the order to enter. He was 38 years old, a career intelligence officer who had served in Berlin since 1953. According to his later reports, he had known about what lay beneath the warehouse for nearly a year, but orders from Moscow had required him to wait until this specific morning to expose it. Inside the warehouse, a steel door opened onto a shaft that descended approximately 15 feet below ground level. From the bottom of that shaft, a tunnel extended westward beneath the border, beneath the death strip with its guard towers and barbed wire, beneath the streets of West Berlin, running for nearly 1,500 feet until it terminated in a chamber beneath a radar installation in the American sector. The tunnel, which had cost approximately $6.7 million to construct, roughly $75 million in current dollars, had been operational for 11 months and 21 days. During that time, it had allowed American and British intelligence services to tap directly into Soviet military communication cables, intercepting an estimated 443,000 conversations and 368,000 teletype messages. When Kotyuba's soldiers entered the warehouse that morning and discovered the tunnel, they would call it the greatest intelligence coup of the early Cold War. What they did not know, what almost no one would know for decades, was that Soviet intelligence had been aware of the tunnel's existence from the very beginning. Before we continue, if you're fascinated by the hidden stories of Cold War espionage and the real human cost behind intelligence operations, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We uncover these documented cases every week, bringing you the truth behind some of history's most consequential secrets. Now, let's explore how this extraordinary operation began. The story of what became known as Operation Gold begins not in Berlin, but in London, in the autumn of 1953, when a proposal was submitted to the Special Intelligence Service, MI6, by a technical officer named Peter Lunn. Lunn, 42 years old, had experience with similar operations in Vienna, where British intelligence had successfully tapped Soviet communication lines by accessing underground cable junctions. His proposal for Berlin was more ambitious. Instead of finding an existing access point, they would create one by digging a tunnel from the American sector into the Soviet sector, positioning it to intercept the main communication cables that carried military traffic between Soviet headquarters in Karlshorst and Moscow. The proposal was extraordinary in its scope and audacity. Berlin in 1953 was a divided city, carved into 4 occupation zones controlled by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. The sectors were separated by checkpoints and increasingly by physical barriers, though the Berlin Wall itself would not be constructed until 1961. The Soviet sector, which would become East Berlin, was under strict control. Any construction project of the scale Lunn was proposing would require absolute secrecy, extensive technical expertise, careful coordination between British and American intelligence services, and continuous security to prevent detection during both construction and operation. MI6 leadership, after reviewing Lunn's proposal, recognized that the operation would require American partnership, both for funding and for access to appropriate real estate in the American sector near the border. In December 1953, MI6 approached the CIA with the proposal, The CIA, under Director Allen Dulles, saw immediate value in the operation. The agency had been searching for ways to penetrate Soviet communications security, and signals intelligence, the interception of communications, was considered one of the highest priorities of the early Cold War intelligence competition. The CIA assigned operational responsibility to its Berlin station, then headed by William King Harvey, a 38-year-old officer with a reputation for aggressive tactics and operational creativity. Harvey, who had previously worked FBI counterintelligence before joining the CIA, was known for his paranoid approach to security and his willingness to undertake risky operations. According to colleagues' later recollections, Harvey viewed the tunnel proposal as an opportunity to demonstrate American technical capability and intelligence superiority. He would oversee the project from planning through operation, coordinating with British partners while maintaining strict compartmentalization of information to minimize the risk of Soviet penetration. What Harvey did not know, what no American or British officer involved in the planning knew, was that a British intelligence officer named George Blake had already informed Soviet intelligence of the entire plan. Blake was 31 years old in early 1954, a MI6 officer assigned to the agency's Berlin station with what appeared to be an exemplary record. He had been born George Behar in Rotterdam in 1922 to an Egyptian Jewish father and a Dutch mother. After his father's death, his mother remarried, and George took his stepfather's surname, Blake. During World War II, he had worked for the Dutch resistance before joining British intelligence. He had been captured during the Korean War and held prisoner from 1950 to 1953. It was during this captivity that Soviet intelligence recruited him. According to Blake's own account, provided decades later, his recruitment had been ideological. He had become convinced during his imprisonment that the Soviet system represented humanity's best hope for the future, and that Western capitalism was fundamentally unjust. Communist political officers had spent months working on him, providing books, engaging in lengthy discussions, and gradually reshaping his worldview. By the time he was released in a prisoner exchange in 1953, he had committed himself to working for Soviet intelligence. Upon his return to Britain, he resumed his MI6 career while covertly providing information to his KGB handlers. Blake's access to Operation Gold's planning was comprehensive. He attended meetings in London where construction plans were discussed, reviewed technical specifications for the tapping equipment, and had knowledge of the proposed timeline and location. According to declassified KGB records released after the Cold War, Blake met with his handler, Sergei Kondrashev, in East Berlin in early 1954 and provided complete details of the tunnel operation, its location, its purpose, the scale of the intelligence collection effort it represented, and the specific Soviet communication cables it would target. The Soviet response to Blake's information was calculated and, from an intelligence perspective, sophisticated. Rather than immediately taking steps to prevent the tunnel's construction or to arrest those involved, KGB leadership in Moscow made a deliberate decision. They would allow the operation to proceed. According to Kondrashev's later explanations, the reasoning was twofold. First, exposing the tunnel immediately would inevitably trigger an investigation into how the Soviets had learned about it, which would endanger Blake, who was considered an extremely valuable long-term asset. Second, Soviet intelligence believed they could control what information the Americans and British intercepted, using the tunnel as a channel to feed disinformation while protecting genuinely sensitive communications through alternative secure channels. The decision required remarkable discipline and compartmentalization. According to later accounts, only a handful of senior KGB officers in Moscow were informed about the tunnel's existence and Blake's reporting. Soviet military commanders in Germany, the personnel who would actually use the communication lines the tunnel would tap, were deliberately kept ignorant. The communications that would be intercepted were to be genuine military traffic, though analysts would later debate whether the most sensitive information was deliberately routed through other channels. The theory was that the volume of routine military communications was so large that completely sanitizing the traffic would alert American analysts that something was wrong, while allowing genuine but not critically sensitive material to flow would make the operation appear successful. Construction of the tunnel began in September 1954. The cover story was that the Americans were building a new radar installation and communications center in Rudo, a district in the American sector near the border with the Soviet sector. The site chosen was a piece of land approximately 600 feet from the border, close enough to allow a tunnel of reasonable length to reach beneath the Soviet sector and access the cable junction point that had been identified through earlier intelligence work. The construction itself was an engineering challenge of considerable complexity. The tunnel needed to be deep enough to avoid detection from routine surface activity, but not so deep that construction would be prohibitively difficult. Engineers settled on a depth of approximately 15 to 20 feet below the surface, which would place it below the frost line and below the depth at which routine construction or utility work would typically occur. The final dimensions were approximately 6 feet in height and 6 feet in width, running nearly 1,500 feet from the American sector beneath the border to the cable junction in the Soviet sector. This size allowed personnel to work inside and housed the equipment necessary for tapping the cables and recording intercepted communications. To avoid detection, all excavated soil had to be removed secretly. The volume of earth removed from a tunnel nearly 1,500 feet long and 6 feet square would be considerable, thousands of cubic yards. The engineers designed a system whereby excavated soil was mixed with concrete and used to construct the floor of the warehouse above the tunnel entrance, as well as other structures on the site. This process required precise calculation to ensure the volume of material being removed matched the volume of construction materials being delivered so that surveillance from the Soviet sector would not notice a discrepancy. The tunnel was dug using specialized equipment brought to Berlin specifically for the project. According to engineering reports, excavation proceeded at a rate of approximately 10 to 15 feet per day, with work continuing in shifts around the clock. The tunnel's route had to be surveyed with exceptional precision to ensure it would emerge at exactly the location of the Soviet cable junction. An error of even a few feet could result in the tunnel missing its target entirely, rendering months of work useless. Workers on the project were told only what they needed to know for their specific tasks. Most believed they were building some kind of communications facility or monitoring station. The true purpose, that they were digging under the border into hostile territory to tap enemy communications, was known only to senior personnel. As weeks of excavation progressed, the operation moved toward its most critical juncture. The most dangerous phase came when the tunnel approached the border and began extending beneath the Soviet sector. Any vibration or ground disturbance detectable from the surface might trigger an investigation. Engineers installed vibration-dampening equipment and monitored seismic activity continuously. The tunnel was equipped with sophisticated air filtration and climate control systems, both to make working conditions bearable and to prevent any exhaust or ventilation that might be detected from above. In February 1955, after approximately 5 months of excavation, the tunnel reached the cable junction beneath Schönefelder Chaussee in the Soviet sector. British technical specialists who had experience with similar cable tapping operations from the Vienna project performed the final work. They installed a chamber at the end of the tunnel where banks of recording equipment would be housed. The cables themselves, thick bundles of copper wire carrying telephone and teletype communications, were accessed through careful cutting and splicing that avoided any noticeable signal degradation. The tapping had to be invisible to Soviet technicians who might inspect the cables during routine maintenance. The operation became fully operational on May 11, 1955. From that date forward, recording equipment in the tunnel chamber captured every signal that passed through the tapped cables. The volume of traffic was enormous. The cables carried communications for Soviet military headquarters in Karlshorst, which coordinated operations for all Soviet forces in East Germany. This included communications between field commanders, logistical traffic, intelligence reports, and administrative messages. The intercepts were not simply recorded and sent to Washington or London for analysis. The tunnel facility included on-site linguists and analysts who worked in shifts, monitoring communications in real time and flagging items of particular interest for immediate relay to intelligence headquarters. The staff in the tunnel worked under extraordinarily difficult conditions. The facility was cramped, artificially lit, ventilated but often stuffy, and required absolute silence to avoid any possibility of detection through vibration or noise. John Morrison, a 28-year-old Russian linguist from Ohio, later described the psychological toll in an interview conducted decades after the operation was declassified. He spoke of the constant awareness that they were physically inside enemy territory, separated from safety by only 15 feet of earth and the border above. He described listening to Soviet officers discussing their families, their frustrations with military bureaucracy, their hopes and fears, and the strange intimacy of understanding these men as human beings while simultaneously treating them as intelligence targets. Another linguist, Sarah Hendricks, who was one of only 3 women working in the tunnel facility, recalled the isolation of being unable to tell even her roommate what she did during those long shifts underground, returning home exhausted but unable to explain why. Several personnel who worked in the tunnel later described experiencing claustrophobia or anxiety that persisted for years afterward, with one analyst reporting recurring dreams about being trapped underground, unable to reach the surface. The intelligence gathered through Operation Gold was extensive and, according to later CIA assessments, genuinely valuable despite the Soviet awareness of the operation. The intercepts provided detailed information on Soviet military order of battle, the organization, strength, and disposition of Soviet forces in East Germany. They provided insights into Soviet military planning, logistics, and doctrine. They revealed command relationships and communication patterns. They also captured KGB personnel occasionally using the military communication lines for their own traffic. Analysis of the intercepts required massive effort. The communications were in Russian, requiring translation. They often used military terminology and references that required contextual knowledge to interpret correctly. The sheer volume, thousands of hours of voice recordings and thousands of pages of teletype messages each month, meant that processing the intelligence required large teams of linguists, analysts, and support personnel working both in Berlin and at CIA and MI6 headquarters. The CIA's eventual assessment, completed after the operation's exposure and based on detailed analysis of the intercepted material compared with other intelligence sources, concluded that the tunnel had provided valuable intelligence despite Soviet knowledge of its existence. According to this assessment, the volume and routine nature of most military communications made it impossible for the Soviets to completely sanitize the traffic without alerting American analysts that something was wrong. While the most sensitive information may have been routed through other channels, and KGB officers later claimed this was the case, the mass of lower-level military communications still provided genuine insights into Soviet capabilities, organization, and procedures. The intelligence also proved valuable for understanding Soviet military terminology, communication protocols, and organizational structures, knowledge that would serve Western intelligence for years. The success validated the enormous investment of resources and risk, even as it demonstrated the vulnerability of technical operations to human betrayal. Through all of this, George Blake continued providing updates to his Soviet handlers. According to later accounts, he met periodically with KGB officers in East Berlin and provided information on the operation's progress, the intelligence being collected, and the American and British assessment of the material. His handlers in turn reported to Moscow, where senior KGB leadership maintained their policy of allowing the operation to proceed while compartmentalizing knowledge of Blake's reporting to an extremely small circle of officers. The operation continued through the summer and fall of 1955 and into early 1956. During this period, the tunnel facility operated continuously, with minimal security incidents. There were close calls, occasions when East German construction crews working in the area came uncomfortably close to discovering the tunnel entrance chamber, or when equipment malfunctions threatened to interrupt service in ways that might have been detected. But through careful planning, technical competence, and good fortune, the operation remained secret from anyone not already aware of it through Blake's reporting. By early 1956, however, KGB leadership in Moscow decided the time had come to expose the tunnel. According to later accounts, several factors influenced this decision. First, Blake was being transferred from Berlin to a position in London, which would reduce his access to information about the tunnel's ongoing operation. If the tunnel were to be exposed in a way that appeared to result from routine discovery rather than betrayal, it needed to happen while Blake's involvement could be obscured. Second, the propaganda value of exposing a major Western intelligence operation on Soviet territory was considerable, and Moscow wanted to exploit that value. Third, there were concerns that the longer the operation continued, the greater the risk that some aspect of the compartmentalized knowledge about Blake's involvement might leak. The plan for exposure was to make it appear accidental. East German construction crews would be conducting routine utility work in the area, would break into the tunnel chamber by chance, and would alert Soviet authorities to what they had found. This would explain the discovery without raising questions about how the Soviets might have known about the tunnel beforehand. On the night of April 21, 1956, heavy rains fell in Berlin. According to the later official Soviet account, the rain caused flooding in underground utility conduits in the area of Schonefelder Chaussee, and repair crews were dispatched to investigate. At approximately 11:30 p.m., these crews discovered the tunnel chamber and the tapping equipment. They immediately notified Soviet military authorities, who in turn notified the KGB. The truth, according to accounts that emerged after the Cold War, was that while the rain was real, the discovery was staged. KGB officers directed the work crews to the specific location where they would find the tunnel entrance. The timing was deliberately chosen, late on a Saturday night, when the tunnel's staffing was at its lightest and when the response could be coordinated for maximum effect the following morning. When Soviet and East German soldiers surrounded the warehouse on Schonefelder Chaussee on the morning of April 22, 1956, The tunnel's operational staff had already been alerted through their security monitoring systems that something was wrong. Vibrations and noise from the Soviet sector had indicated unusual activity near the cable junction. At approximately 2:30 a.m., the decision was made to evacuate the tunnel and seal the American end. Recording equipment was shut down, sensitive materials were removed, and the staff withdrew to the warehouse in the American sector. By the time Lieutenant Colonel Kotzyuba and his soldiers entered the tunnel from the East Berlin end at approximately 8:45 a.m., the facility was empty except for the permanent installation, the recording equipment, the cable taps, and the tunnel structure itself. They found a sophisticated intelligence facility, complete with air conditioning, electrical systems, and banks of recording equipment still warm from recent use. What they did not find was any personnel or any intelligence materials that had not already been removed. The Soviet response to the discovery was carefully orchestrated for propaganda purposes. Western journalists were invited to tour the tunnel from the East Berlin end. Photographs were taken showing Soviet officers examining the American equipment. Press releases emphasized the violation of East German sovereignty and characterized the tunnel as an act of espionage aggression by the United States and Britain. The Soviet news agency TASS published extensive coverage describing the tunnel as a breach of the most elementary norms of international law and evidence of the true aggressive intentions of the imperialist powers. The Western response was more measured. The CIA and MI6 initially declined to comment on the tunnel's existence, following standard protocol of neither confirming nor denying specific intelligence operations. However, as the Soviet propaganda campaign continued and as journalists began piecing together the story from other sources, American and British officials began acknowledging the operation in general terms while declining to discuss specific details or capabilities. William King Harvey, the CIA officer who had overseen the tunnel's construction and operation, later reflected that the exposure, while unfortunate, was not catastrophic. The operation had been productive for nearly a year, and the intelligence gathered would continue to be analyzed and exploited for years to come. The fact that it had been discovered by what appeared to be routine construction work rather than through a security breach suggested that operational security had been maintained. What Harvey did not know, what he would never know in his lifetime, was that George Blake had betrayed the operation from its inception and that the discovery had been staged by the Soviets to protect their source. Blake's role would not be discovered for another 5 years. In 1961, a Polish intelligence officer named Michael Goleniewski defected to the West and provided information that led MI6 to investigate Blake's activities. During interrogation, Blake confessed to having worked for Soviet intelligence since 1951. His confession included details of his reporting on Operation Gold and numerous other operations he had compromised during his decade as a Soviet agent. Blake was tried in May 1961 at the Old Bailey in London on 5 counts of violating the Official Secrets Act. The trial was conducted partly in closed session to protect ongoing intelligence operations. According to court records, the prosecutor described Blake as having caused incalculable damage to the security of the United Kingdom through his years of espionage. Blake showed little remorse, stating that he had acted according to his conscience and his belief that the Soviet system was superior to Western capitalism. On May 3, 1961, Blake was sentenced to 42 years in prison, one of the longest sentences ever handed down in a British espionage case. The judge, Lord Chief Justice Parker, explained that the sentence reflected the extraordinary scope and duration of Blake's betrayal. Blake was incarcerated at Wormwood Scrubbs Prison in London, where he served 5.5 years before escaping in 1966 with help from fellow inmates recruited by the KGB to assist him. He fled to the Soviet Union and never returned to Britain. The revelation that the tunnel had been compromised from its inception forced a painful reassessment within American and British intelligence services. Had the entire operation been worthless? Had the Soviets used it to feed disinformation? The questions were troubling, but the answers, after careful analysis, were more nuanced than simple failure. Blake's betrayal had certainly damaged the operation's potential, but it had not rendered it completely valueless. The decision by Soviet leadership to allow the tunnel to operate rather than expose it immediately had been based on their assessment that protecting Blake was more important than preventing the intelligence loss. This calculation meant that while the Soviets could route their most sensitive communications through alternative channels, they could not completely shut down or sanitize the traffic flowing through the tapped cables without risking exposure of their source. The tunnel material continued to be analyzed for years after the operation ended. Linguists and analysts worked through thousands of hours of recorded conversations and thousands of pages of teletype messages, creating intelligence reports that contributed to Western understanding of Soviet military organization, capabilities, and procedures. Some material provided immediate tactical value. Other material contributed to longer-term strategic assessments. For the individuals most directly involved in Operation Gold, the consequences and life trajectories varied considerably. William King Harvey continued his CIA career after Berlin, though his aggressive operational style and heavy drinking would eventually lead to conflicts with agency leadership. He was reassigned from Berlin to Miami, where he worked on anti-Castro operations during the early 1960s and later to Rome. He retired from the CIA in 1967, increasingly marginalized within the agency despite his early successes. He died in 1976 at the age of 60 from complications related to his long-term alcohol abuse. According to colleagues who knew him in his final years, Harvey remained intensely proud of the tunnel operation, considering it a major technical and operational achievement. He died without ever knowing that George Blake had compromised it from the beginning. Peter Lunn, the MI6 officer who had originally proposed the operation based on his Vienna experience, continued his career in British intelligence. He served in various positions around the world until his retirement in 1968. He rarely spoke publicly about the tunnel, maintaining the discretion expected of intelligence officers even decades after the operation. He died in 2011 at the age of 99. In limited interviews given late in his life, he reflected that the tunnel had been worthwhile despite Blake's betrayal, and that the technical achievement it represented had been valuable in itself as a demonstration of Western capability and resolve. Sergei Kondrashev, George Blake's KGB handler who had received the initial intelligence about the tunnel and had managed the relationship throughout the operation, considered the case both a success and a missed opportunity. He had successfully protected Blake's identity while the tunnel operated, ensuring that one of the KGB's most valuable assets remained in place for years. However, in interviews given after the Cold War ended, Kondrashev acknowledged that the decision to allow the tunnel to operate had been controversial within the KGB. Some officers argued that the propaganda value of exposing it immediately would have outweighed the intelligence protection benefits. Others contended that the tunnel should have been used more aggressively to feed disinformation to the West. The middle path that was chosen satisfied no one completely, though it did achieve the primary objective of protecting Blake for continued espionage. George Blake lived in Moscow for more than 50 years after his escape from British prison. He was given a comfortable apartment, a pension, and occasional work as a translator and consultant on intelligence matters. He married a Russian woman, Ida, and had a son. He gave occasional interviews to journalists and historians, always maintaining that he had acted according to his principles and had no regrets about his service to the Soviet Union. However, Blake's defection came at enormous personal cost. His first wife, Gillian, whom he had married in 1953, and their 3 children, Anthony, James, and Patrick, were left behind when he fled to the Soviet Union. According to later accounts, his sons struggled profoundly with their father's betrayal and abandonment. Anthony Blake, who had been 7 years old when his father was arrested, later described growing up knowing his father was a convicted traitor, dealing with bullying at school, and struggling to understand how the man he remembered as a loving parent could have done what he did. The family changed their surname to try to escape the stigma. Anthony later worked as a photographer and gave rare interviews in which he described the permanent sense of shame and confusion that shadowed his entire adult life, the difficulty of forming his own identity separate from his father's infamy. Blake never saw his first wife or their children again after his escape, though he reportedly expressed regret about this separation in his later years. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Blake remained in Russia, which he considered his adopted home. He continued living quietly in Moscow, granted honors by the Russian government for his service to Soviet intelligence. He died in Moscow on December 26, 2020, at the age of 98, one of the last surviving participants in the Berlin Tunnel operation and one of the most damaging spies in British intelligence history. The tunnel itself remained in place for years after its discovery. The Soviet end was eventually sealed, but the structure, nearly 500 feet of reinforced tunnel beneath the former border between East and West Berlin, remained intact. After the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and German reunification, portions were opened to the public as part of the Allied Museum in Berlin, where visitors can now walk through sections of the actual tunnel and see exhibits about its construction and operation. The displays include photographs of the construction process, examples of the recording equipment used, technical diagrams, and detailed explanations of how the operation worked. The tunnel has become a historical attraction, a piece of Cold War history that people can physically experience, walking through the same confined space where linguists and analysts once sat in shifts, headphones on, listening to Soviet officers discussing troop movements and supply problems and weekend plans. For the city of Berlin, the tunnel represents one chapter in a much larger story about division, espionage, and eventual reunification. The city that was split between East and West for 45 years is now whole. The border that once divided it, with its guard towers and death strips and checkpoints, exists only in memory and in preserved sections maintained as memorials. The wall that would be built in 1961 and that would define Berlin for 28 years was torn down in 1989. The tunnel, built to penetrate that division, now serves as a reminder of a time when such extraordinary measures seemed necessary and justified to both sides in an ideological conflict that shaped the world for half a century. The questions raised by the Berlin Tunnel operation extend beyond intelligence tradecraft to fundamental issues about cost, benefit, and moral complexity in espionage. The tunnel cost approximately $6.7 million to build and operate. It employed dozens of personnel over 11 months. It required cooperation between 2 major intelligence agencies and drew resources from other priorities. The intelligence gathered was extensive and, by most accounts, genuinely valuable. But the operation was compromised from its inception by a source the West did not know existed. The CIA's assessment was that despite Blake's betrayal, the tunnel provided valuable intelligence because the Soviets could not completely sanitize their communications without alerting Western analysts that something was wrong. The KGB's assessment was that they had successfully protected a valuable source while controlling the damage from the tunnel's operation. Both sides approached the operation from their own strategic perspective, measuring success by different criteria, and both found reasons to claim victory even as both acknowledged costs and failures they had not anticipated. The Berlin Tunnel also illustrated the fundamental tension between human intelligence and technical intelligence. Blake was a human source, a person with access who provided information. The tunnel was technical collection, a device that intercepted communications. The tunnel's compromise demonstrated that even the most sophisticated technical operation could be defeated by a well-placed human source. Yet the intelligence gathered from the tunnel also demonstrated that technical collection, when successful, could provide volumes of information impossible to obtain through human sources alone. For historians studying Cold War intelligence, Operation Gold provides insight into how both superpowers thought about espionage, technology, risk, and reward during the 1950s. The operation required both sides to make difficult calculations. The Americans and British had to weigh potential intelligence value against financial cost, the risk of discovery, and the international incident that would result if exposed. The Soviets had to weigh the intelligence they were conceding against the value of protecting Blake and the propaganda opportunity that eventual exposure would provide. Both sides made their calculations based on imperfect information and uncertain outcomes. Neither could know for certain what the result would be. The Americans and British succeeded in building and operating a sophisticated intelligence collection facility, but remained unaware it had been compromised. The Soviets succeeded in protecting their source, but could not entirely prevent intelligence losses. Both sides operated in uncertainty, making decisions that seemed rational at the time, but whose full consequences would only become clear years or decades later. What remains undeniable is the human cost, which extended far beyond the intelligence agencies involved. The tunnel workers who spent months in confined underground spaces, unable to discuss their work with anyone, several of whom suffered lasting psychological effects. George Blake's first family, particularly his 3 sons, who grew up with the stigma of having a father who was a convicted traitor and who then abandoned them entirely when he fled to Moscow. The British intelligence officers whose operations Blake had compromised, some of whom may have been captured or killed as a result of his betrayals in other cases beyond the tunnel. The Soviet and East German officials who were disciplined or purged when their communications were later revealed to have been intercepted, even though the decision to allow the interception had been made by KGB leadership in Moscow without their knowledge. The tunnel was 1,476 feet long, 6 feet high, 6 feet wide, and 15 to 20 feet below the surface. It operated for 11 months and 21 days. It cost $6.7 million to build. It intercepted 443,000 conversations and 368,000 teletype messages. It was compromised from the beginning by a man who believed he was serving a higher cause. It was discovered by soldiers who had been told where to look. It was considered a triumph of engineering and a masterpiece of espionage, and it was also a betrayal and a deception. George Blake was 31 when he chose to inform the Soviets. He was 98 when he died in Moscow, having never returned to Britain or reconciled with the family he abandoned. William King Harvey was 38 when he oversaw the tunnel's construction. He was 60 when he died, never knowing that his greatest operational success had been exposed before it began. And the tunnel itself remains a dark passage beneath a reunified city a monument to the extraordinary efforts nations will undertake to steal each other's secrets, and to the human costs of those efforts that can never be fully calculated or repaid.